Good evening, everybody, and greetings on the occasion of International Mountain Day. Can I share the screen now? Yeah, can you see my screen?
Wait a minute, sir. Wait a minute.
Not yet, sir.
Now you can.
Yeah.
Sir, now you can do.
Yeah. No, I was supposed to give some closing remarks, but I thought, having listened to the last 3-4 hours, different presentations and reflections, I might as well take about 10 minutes or so in giving my own reflections on the mountains and the pandemic. Now we have talked about the mountains. Let me begin by talking about the characteristics of this COVID-19 pandemic. It's a pandemic that transmits through airborne droplets and interpersonal contacts. The transmission is much faster in dense human settings and closed spaces. This has implications for the mountains. And the virus itself has linkages. It has linkages, as was pointed out earlier, to degradation of environmental habitats. It's a zoonotic pathogen, basically coming as a result of the interaction between wild animals and humans. It also has linkages, in spite of what Dr. Su said in his speech. It also has linkages with industrial agricultural complex. If industrial agricultural livestock complex becomes too complicated, does not recognize the ecological limits, then virus can also have a chance of spreading out. This is at least coming out of the recent literature on the subject. And as Dr. Pema Gyamtso has pointed out, it also has linkages to climate change. Now, given this characteristic and nature of the COVID pandemic, there are certain positives, certain negatives arising out of this pandemic for the mountains. Let me just posit some of the major implications of the pandemic on mountain areas. The first, I think, is this exacerbated feeling of remoteness and isolation. Mountains are remote and isolated, but because of the constrained mobility and contact, decline of a lot of activities like tourism and so forth, pandemic has resulted in exacerbated feeling of remoteness and isolation in the mountains. The second implication is, this feeling of intense dependence. Mountain areas have come to realize that inordinate dependence on the outside world, being part of the globalization trend. As a result of the pandemic, there are constraints on the market, constraints on trade linkages, there are concerns for food security, there are concerns for supply of essential supplies. Therefore, pandemic has implications on the economic fragility of the mountains as such. The third is, as a result of pandemic, we, in Nepal and many mountain areas, in Pakistan, India, Afghanistan, and so forth, people have come to realize the limitations of a remittance economy and employment. Thus far, remittance has been one way of moving outside from mountain habitats, taking advantage of opportunities available overseas and in other countries, and bringing income back. But the limitations of this remittance economy and employment has become apparent as a result of the pandemic. There have been dislocation of migration flows. There have been slowdown of remittance income and employment. There have been return migration, putting pressure, particularly in the demand on foodstuff and other natural resources in areas where they come. The fourth implication of the pandemic has been on poor social infrastructure. Many of these mountain areas have poor health and education infrastructure. Now, these infrastructures are the ones which are needed in times of pandemic, but because of the lack of investment in the past, lack of proper management, the condition of health education infrastructure is very poor. As a result, there's a need to invest more on these kind of infrastructures. in the future. And there's also a need to link these infrastructures to off-farm activities, for example, like tourism. The fifth is, this whole need for a sustainable production regime to be operative in the mountains. As many of the speakers earlier pointed out, the production regime in the mountains is more import dependent. The production regime in the mountain is not participatory. The production regime in the mountain is not innovative in the context of particular ecological systems. And therefore, there's a need to reflect. It has made us aware of the need to reflect on needs-based organic production so that productions become ecologically more sustainable. They're not just technological fixes, but also ecological fixes so that they become sustainable in the context of the mountains. The other implication of the pandemic has also been this whole notion of scale in the mountains, scale of settlements. Settlements in the mountains are very scale sensitive. So therefore, if you look at the pandemic and the impact it has made on mountain areas, what becomes immediately apparent is that areas that have larger urban areas are the ones that are more affected. Areas that do have smaller urban places where the interaction is lower, the effect of the pandemic is much lower, which gives us lesson that small, medium scale urban industrial growth is the strategy that we should be pursuing in the future and not going on for larger scale urbanization, larger scale agro-industrial growth in the mountains. The other implication is environmental. For nature, it does not make much sense whether you have a pandemic or not. For nature, as the keynote speaker in the first session pointed out, nature has its own way of finding out, of maintaining its own biodiversity. Now, the biodiversity that we talk about is biodiversity for people. Therefore, there are positive, negative implications of the pandemic on the environment. But there's a need to safeguard, protect habitats, make sure that the habitats are not degraded, maintain biodiversity to human advantage, in a particular ecological context, and take advantage of specific ecological niches that are available. Then the other implication is that the pandemic made us realize the blessings of technology. Because of the pandemic, for example, there has been accelerated use of information technology, and as one of the speakers pointed out, there has been almost a technological transition in the making. As a result, in the years to come, if the mountain areas are to survive and take advantage of new knowledge and new information, they have got to accelerate the use of information technology in the mountains. The dependence on the mountains has come up to the fore as a result of the pandemic. That also brings out an issue that we have not talked about, that is, many mountain areas are losing population because of migration and so forth. Because of the loss of population in mountain areas, many mountain areas are not being sustainably managed. Therefore, there is also a need, like for example, in the mountain districts of Nepal, about 23 mountain districts in Nepal had lost absolute population in the last census in 2011. Now, if mountain areas go on losing population, then for ecological maintenance of mountain habitats, the population required will not be there. And no one would be able to take advantage of niche-based natural resources, agriculture, small, medium-scale enterprises that are possible, adventure culture, tourism that might be possible in the mountains. Therefore, there is also a need to stabilize mountain population by providing them with new opportunities that are in line with the ecological context of mountains. The other implication that we have, that we came to realize after the pandemic in the mountains, is the need for community solidarity and social capital. mountains are not just natural systems. Mountains are also social systems. There's a need to enhance, nurture, and innovate within those social systems in such a way that mountains become healthy, economic, social, cultural, and ecological habitats. Now, in many mountain areas now, we talk about pandemic, we talk about natural disasters, we talk about climate change. Very often, these are taken as three different issues. What the pandemic, climate change, disaster, etc. have made us realize is that one needs to take a holistic view of things. There have got to be integrated policies dealing with pandemic, disaster, and climate change. And institutions that are there also have to develop this integrated approach to addressing pandemic, disaster, and climate change. And if there are any inevitability in mountain areas, there are two inevitabilities. The first inevitability is that of accelerated climate change, as all speakers have pointed out. And the second inevitability is frequent and periodic pandemics that are bound to occur periodically, and frequently. And therefore, in view of these inevitabilities of climate change and frequent and periodic pandemics, there's a rethinking required with respect to economic, social, and environmental development strategies for mountains. Should mountains go on for economic growth strategies that have been pursued in other areas? Should mountains take a completely different approach to more ecologically harmonious, ecologically balanced kind of an approach to development? Now, these are very crucial issues. The pandemic has brought these issues to the forefront, as climate change brought these issues to the forefront also, and therefore there's a need for rethinking economic, social, environmental development strategies for mountains in the years to come. Now, these are some of the remarks that I have. With this, I have one more task, and that is to thank you all, participants, contributors, for your forbearance. On behalf of the organizing parties, I'd like to thank all the distinguished participants from mountain areas from around the globe for the valuable contribution to this wave conference. To organizing partners through an University Central Department of Environmental Studies, Kathmandu University Department of Environmental Sciences, MICD of the Midwestern University, IUCN Nepal, Himalayan Map House, and Resources Himalaya Foundation. I'd like to propose a vote of thanks. For Resources Himalaya Foundation, special thanks are due for hosting this conference. To the keynote speakers, Professor Corner, Professor Ju, a special vote of thanks for extremely high quality and very informed presentation. To Prahlad Thapa and Dr. Ramesh Maske for ably summing up the presentations, which is by no means an envious task. To moderators, Dr. Dinesh Bhuju, Dr. Dinesh Neopane, Dr. Regina Maske Benju, a vote of thanks for very ably moderating the sessions, and to Dr. Ram Chetri, Chair of the Resource Himalaya Foundation, for providing an effective welcome remark. And finally, before I end, for special remarks, let me thank Dr. Pema Gyantso, the newly appointed Director General of ICIMOD. May we also welcome you to Nepal, and we wish you all success in your future endeavors. With this, I'd like to share at last, how pandemic has leveled the world. Thanks to pandemic, even a small institution like ours, Resource Himalaya Foundation, and other institutions that have cooperated, have come together to organize this international conference, which we would not have otherwise thought possible. Now, that is basically as a result of the pandemic. Therefore, there are some positive things to be said about the pandemic too, I guess. With this, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this conference, contributing to it, and to the supporting teams and volunteers who have remained behind the scene for working painstakingly to make this wave conference a success. Thank you all. Good night from Nepal. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, as the case might be, and thank you and goodbye.